Hello and welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm Christine Niles. Father Paul Mankowski is likely a name you're unfamiliar with, but he's someone that you need to come to know. He led a remarkable life with degrees from the University of Chicago, Harvard, and Oxford. He trained as a boxer. He thought he was going to get married until God called him to the priesthood, to the Jesuit order in particular, where he would spend 44 years of his life. And then on September 3rd, 2020, he died suddenly from a burst aneurysm in his brain. He left behind a trail of treasured writings on the liturgy, the church, and the faith. And one recently published book titled The Sound of Silence, The Life and Canceling of a Heroic Jesuit Priest is written by Karen Hall. Karen is his former supervising producer for the hit TV series Moonlighting. If you remember that show with Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd, I loved that show as a child. I used to watch it all the time. And she also worked on hit shows like MASH, Hill Street Blues, Judging Amy, and The Good Wife, among others. She's been nominated for 7 Emmys and 6 Writers Guild of America awards, in addition to winning 4 Humanitas prizes, among others. So Karen joins me today to talk about her book, about the life, the heroic life of Father Paul Mankowski. Karen, it is so great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, first, congratulations on your book. And it's such an interesting topic, and it's also unique because it's the only book so far that goes into the details about how Father Mankowski was canceled. So could you please give a brief background about Father Mankowski's life, who he was, and then why you were inspired to write about him?
Okay. He was, like you said, a Jesuit from the Chicago province. He grew up in South Bend, and he had a normal life, as normal of a life as you can have when you're really brilliant. So, he went to the University of Chicago. He majored in classical studies. He learned a lot of languages, and, it's always really impressive that he spoke about 12 languages and half of them were dead. But he told me that he just learned languages because it was always an easy A. So it gives you a different perspective. He had planned to go to University of Chicago for graduate school. He had a fiance. He was planning to be a professor of classical studies. And then God just hit him out of nowhere with a very loud vocation. And he said he spent about 8 weeks telling God, no, thank you. He said, I'll get married and have lots of Catholic kids and put more than my share in the collection plate, but get someone else to be your priest. And he said, God just kept saying, no, you. And so he finally relented. And he knew also that his vocation was not just to be a priest, but also to be a Jesuit. So when he finally said uncle, he called it Jesuit. They called the Jesuits, and he went to go study with them.
Wow. All right, so let's turn to your book. You have a lot of interesting things to say in it, but what did you mean in your book when you said that Father was canceled long before today's cancel culture?
Well, even when I first started writing the book, which was about 3 years ago, canceling a priest was kind of unheard of. And the Jesuits told him that he was not allowed to write or to speak on anything other than his area of expertise, and that was ancient Semitic languages. So he had a lot to say about the church and the culture and everything that we're going through now in its early stages, but they wouldn't let him write about it. And so he was pretty much invisible from church publications and where you would expect to have seen his writing.
And why did they not let him publish?
He was always at odds with them because he was very orthodox, and he was outnumbered by people who were not orthodox. And it came to a head. He had about 10 years where he wrote articles that you can still search and read today that are excellent, and that all had to do with the changes that were happening in the church and why they weren't good. But it came to a head when he took up opposition to a Jesuit congressman named Robert Drinan. He served, I think, 6 terms in Congress, and he was very vocal and supportive of access to abortion. And he really set a lot of the policies that the Democrats have in play today. He kind of spearheaded that early on. And obviously, Paul thought that a Jesuit should not be speaking out against life. And he did research to write an article about it. He ended up not writing the article. And he gave the research to church historian James Hitchcock to just have for posterity. And a while went by and he was still writing. And then James Hitchcock decided to publish it when Robert Drinan sided with Bill Clinton against the ban on partial birth abortion. And so he felt like it was time to tell that story. And so when he did, he offered to leave Paul's name out of it, and Paul didn't want him to do that. So as soon as the Jesuits knew that Paul had told the press about Robert Drinan and shined a light on him, that was the last straw for them, and that's when they officially silenced him.
Wow. I think anybody who knows about the Jesuits today knows that they are one of the worst as far as orthodoxy. Also, very high rate of sex abuse, which is extremely tragic, of course, because anybody who knows the history of the Jesuits knows when they were first formed, they were called the Pope's men. I mean, they were one of the most courageous priests, one of the most courageous orders ever back then. And then just how far they have fallen. So I can't even imagine what it would be like today in today's modern Jesuit order to be an Orthodox priest.
What I've been hearing is that the young Jesuits are conservative, and I've heard from a couple of them since my book came out. So I'm hoping that there's still hope for the order.
That's great. That's great to hear. Let's go back to your book and some of the things that you wrote. Could you talk a bit about the straw man fallacy as it was applied to Father Mankowski?
Yes. Because of the way things were, he didn't exactly get invited to a lot of Jesuit parties because he referred to himself as a pariah where they were concerned. And so there weren't a lot of people who really knew him, but everybody knew the legend of how bad he was. And so I would have Jesuits explaining to me under the heading of "keep away from that guy," that he was a hate monger, he was a bigot, he was a homophobe, he was a misogynist. There's about 25 other bad terms. And I kept saying to them, I don't know the person you're describing to me. And if I did, I certainly wouldn't be friends with them. Because he really was not. He was kind. He was very learned and very nuanced. He didn't speak in black and white.
Mm-hmm. Your book also features correspondence between Father and his superiors. And could you talk a little bit about what those letters reveal?
Well, one of them was the letter that officially silenced him. And so, a lot of that was very formal, the letter. It's in my book. And Paul said that he actually got along well with the provincial who wrote that letter, and it was more a letter that he had to write. But because it was coming down from on high, he had to tell Paul that he couldn't write anymore. Paul wrote back a long letter, which is also in my book, where he talked about why he wanted to be a Jesuit, why he felt that was God called him to do, and that's where he wanted to, he said he wanted to live and die as a Jesuit. And it took him a long time to get final vows, but Jesuits have 2 sets of vows, and it took him, I think, around 36 years to get the final set because they just didn't want to fully incorporate him. And in fact, they tried everything they could think of to get him to leave. They gave him a lot of really bad job assignments. They sent him to Jordan during the Arab Spring. I was very worried about him at that point. And finally, he said somebody came to his room one day with a nice severance package and explained that they would make it really easy for him to leave. And he told them that he had taken a vow to live and die as a Jesuit, and he had every intention of doing that. And so he kind of called their bluff, and they finally had to give him final vows.
Wow. Wow, that's impressive.
I know.
Well, Archbishop Sheen wrote a beautiful book that I believe every priest should read. I've talked about it in the past. It's called The Priest is Not His Own, and it emphasizes that of all the roles of the priest, above all, the priest is a victim, just as our Lord was the victim who gave himself for us and whose sacrifice obtained for us eternal life. So priests are also called to follow in Christ's footsteps, to be an alter Christus, another Christ. It seems like Father exemplified that in his life. He understood that. Could you talk a little bit about the sufferings he endured in his community and from failed leadership?
He was an introvert like me, so I don't know how much he was upset that he didn't get invited to a lot of parties. But he told me that the thing that he disliked the most about the way things took place was that he never got to be around younger people because they didn't want him to be a bad influence on them. And he was allowed to be around his students and talk to them about the languages that he taught, but he really wanted to have more interaction with both younger people and lay Catholics. So he kind of was put into an ancient Semitic languages ghetto, and he just didn't really get to live his life the way he should have.
And I imagine too, I mean, priests, one of the problems with, and I've heard from priests, is that they can kind of suffer from isolation. I imagine he must have had some of that if he was being treated as a pariah by his.
Definitely.
Yeah.
He also always had a group of friends, which I guess I was one. He had close friends who we were kind of all foxhole buddies together because we were fighting for the same side. And he told me, he said, if you join this fight, the fight for orthodoxy as opposed to modernism, he said, you won't have many friends, but the friends you have will be the greatest friends you could possibly have. And he was right about that.
Right. Well, your book details how, in spite of his tribulations and sufferings, Father Mankowski remained faithful to the church. He offered up his sufferings for the purification and renewal of his order, which, again, that's wonderful to see when a priest can remain and persevere to the end with his vows. Because as we see, we know there are a lot of priests today who they get disillusioned, because of persecution, sidelining, whatever. And some of them, they just decide to leave. They leave the church, they leave the faith sometimes, they go into schism. Can you talk a little bit about Father Mankowski's decision to remain faithful to the church to the very end and offer up his sufferings for his order?
Yeah. And, a lot of it was just his personality. He was just very determined. And he used to tell me, and he told everybody who would listen, he said, "I'm not going anywhere, I'm right." And that helps me a lot these days. But he took his vows very seriously. He never owned more than he could put into a medium-sized box in case he got reassigned suddenly. And because he thought if you took a vow of poverty, you should have a vow of poverty. And the same with his other vows. He just believed everything so strongly. And, he didn't think that God was winking when God made that vow with him. So, he was just determined that he was going to live out his vows.
That's wonderful. So obviously you knew Father personally. When did you meet him? How long do you know him? What sort of impact did he have on your life?
I met him in 2007, which was probably not coincidentally the same year that he was silenced. And we became great friends. Almost from the beginning, because like I said, we saw each other as foxhole buddies, and we knew we were going to need to have that kind of friend. Both of us I think we're both writers. We bonded over that a lot. And so when we would write letters, I was kind of silenced at the time because when I had my conversion experience, I suddenly wasn't as popular in show business as I had been. And he was silenced because of them. So we did a lot of writing to each other that I think we would have written elsewhere, but weren't able to. And that's why I had a lot of good stuff, good writing from him that I could put into the book.
Do you think his heroic witness is a good example for others today? I mean, including priests who may be sidelined or the faithful?
Anybody who is trying to tough it out right now. And I know that my first thought when I found out he had died was, how am I going to get through this muck now? But quickly I realized that I had learned so much from him, and I really had internalized his voice in terms of, having strength to persevere with the various martyrdoms we're going through right now. And that really changed my life. And, it was over a course of 14 years, and it wasn't something I thought about every day, but especially since he's been gone, I really understand how much he changed my life.
What do you think What do you think his life, his witness, his sufferings, his offering them up, what do you think they can teach people today who are suffering in the church?
They can read his life as a witness to, because, we're having the same fight right now, only more so. So the people who are Orthodox and are trying to tough it out right now, well, every morning you get up and something else is crumbling. And to have the strength to just keep going in spite of that, I think he showed me how to have that strength. And he also taught me, I really genuinely thought he was holy. And so he taught me that holy did not look like I had thought it was going to look. Holy can have a sense of humor, and not be, stiff and stodgy. And he made me want to aspire to it. I've got a long way to go, but
Well, so do we all. But yeah, that was something else too, because I was doing a little background reading on him and his writings, and I think he gave this witness, like you said, sense of humor. And it's so easy, I think, today for people who feel sidelined in the church, who may be in a bad diocese, who may be looking at the scandals of the church, to become very disillusioned, very angry, very bitter. And you do have priests out there who are very angry and very bitter, but it doesn't sound like that's how Father Mankowski reacted to things. It sounds like he was able to maintain a good attitude and a sense of humor in spite of everything.
He was, but I also think that what anger he did have came out as a sardonic sense of humor instead of ranting and raving. He wrote a lot of parodies that were really good, and you could tell that he was venting about what was going on. But like we are now, he's just powerless to do anything about it.
Right. All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for that little insight into the life of Father Paul Mankowski. Can you please let our audience know where they can find you as well as your book?
Yes, they can find the book at sophiainstitute.com or all of the other places that you buy books. You can find me online at karenhall.me. My website is a work in progress, but I'd be happy to find you there.
Okay, great. And you've written other books?
I wrote a novel called Dark Debts that came out years ago. It's still in print, and it's kind of like The Exorcist. And right now I'm writing the sequel to that, even though it's a lot of years later. And I'm working on 3 books right now, so we'll see.
Oh, good for you. And they can also find those at your website?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much. Her book, again, is titled The Sound of Silence, The Life and Canceling of a Heroic Jesuit Priest. And that is karenhall.me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Karen. Great talking with you.
Thank you, Christine.
All right. Congratulations on your book. Once again, go to our website, karenhall.me. Book is titled The Sound of Silence, The Life and Canceling of a Heroic Jesuit Priest. And we do need those good examples. We do need those good witnesses, especially, as you all know, the state of the church today and all the scandals. It is so easy to get disillusioned and depressed, and some people fall into despair. And it's so important to see real life examples of priests who've been through it, who have really been through it and then stuck faithfully to the very end. They persevered. It's one of the prayers I pray all the time. Give me the grace of final perseverance, because it doesn't really matter where you begin. A lot of people begin well. What it matters is where you end. That's what matters. So anyway, if I can be so bold as to say, Father Paul Mankowski, pray for us. All right, thank you so much for watching and listening. And in the words of St. Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward, boldly.